So I told my 320,000 followers on TikTok and Instagram that this is my top 10 reads of the year list. This is in order. I actually told them that Creep was my #1 favorite book of the year. Yeah, I did a whole top 20 list. Here's a little bit of the selection of exactly what I said about my favorite reads of the year. Here's my top 5 books from the year. At number 5, we have The Palestine Laboratory. At number 4, we have Something in the Woods Loves You by Jared K. Anderson. At number 3, we have All Things Are Too Small, Essays in Praise of Excess by Becca Rothfeld. At number 2, we have There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension by Hanif Abdurraqib. At number 1, we have Creep, Accusations and Confessions by Miriam Gerba. And it's not true. I love all of these books, but I read a lot of fiction this year that I didn't really talk about online because I feel like my role over the past few years with Book Talk and Bookstagram has just been a nonfiction resource for people. I really only talk about nonfiction on these platforms because I think that's what I add value to over there. And so everything that I've talked about has basically only been nonfiction. And I love talking about it. It's a big part of who I am. But that's not really an accurate portrayal of the things that I enjoy reading. So my top 20 reads of the year list actually includes 7 fiction books, and my favorite read of the year last year wasn't Creep. It was a fiction book. So I'm going to give you the entire list. We're going to go the honorable mentions that were in my top 20, and now they're at number 27. I'm going to go all the way to 1, and we're going to talk a little bit about all of them because I think they're all excellent books that you should add to your list, and hopefully you can get a sense for who I am as a reader. So these were originally in my top 20, and now these are all the honorable mention titles. It happens to be just that all the nonfiction titles are now my honorable mentions, but let's talk about them a little bit. First up, we have Men Who Hate Women, From Incels to Pickup Artists, The Truth About Extreme Misogyny and How It Affects Us All by Laura Bates. This book is truly encyclopedic in its understanding and synthesis of exactly this alt-right pipeline of the misogyny that infects culture and kind of the red pill and black pills part of society. I think this book is like one of the most educational reading experiences that I've ever had in my life. I think this is not only a great resource, but it's also really accessible. And so it's one of those kind of academic texts that is fully encompassing of a topic, but yet it still like puts you in a really grounded reality where you will definitely understand every single part of this book. And there's so much reflections on culture that Laura has for these topics that I think it's like a perfect blend of both fascinating writing and journalism and also really good historiography on our present moment. Next up, we have Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation by Silvia Federici. And this is one of the most dense reads that I've ever had in my life. I found this book incredibly fascinating, even though like the text is only about 150 pages. It took me really long time to really get into it because it's one of those things that just requires so much extra care and attention. However, this is one of the best reframings of history and how we consider the birth of capitalism, specifically in a gendered aspect. I think this book provides perfect contextualization for not only like how we got here, but also I think it like illuminates history in a really fascinating way that I think audiences will latch onto. We read this one for my book club last year, and even though it's a really difficult read, my book club absolutely loved this because it was some of the most fascinating conversations that we have ever had. I adore this book. I think it's one that you have to take time with. You have to take it a little slow because it just genuinely requires that. But if you get into it, I think you're going to fall in love with thinking about history in this way because it is so enrapturing. Maybe my most traumatizing read of last year was Wild Faith, How the Christian Right is Taking Over America by Talia Lavin. This book is really great look at the Christian right and its rise to power. A lot of books have done that, specifically like Jesus and John Wayne is a really popular title from the last few years. And I think it's wonderful. I genuinely think that's like a must-read book to understand everything in modern politics. However, this book also goes through that same history in a much briefer pattern, so it's a little bit more accessible to readers. And I think it gives a great look at the politics of this current moment. However, what this does in the second half of the book is supplant you firmly within the households of how nationalism is growing in this country, specifically Christian nationalism, of course. And it's really harrowing. Like, it's truly one of those books that I thought I'd kind of gotten over my religious trauma. You know, I'm 32 now, and so I figured, you know, I left the church 15 years ago, and I thought, you know, I've made progress since then. I've gotten over thinking about this and feeling all of those feelings. And then I read this book about spanking, about how Christian nationalism thrives in the isolation of the home, specifically like in small towns and ingrained communities. And it just broke me apart. And I sobbed while reading this one. It's a nightmare to get through. And it was also incredibly rewarding because I saw the presentation of not only like the personal but also the political. And so I think it is truly a fabulous read, but it's one of those ones that I don't often talk about trigger warnings in nonfiction because I think people generally know what they're getting into in this genre, but I absolutely would caution you about reading this. If that is not a trauma that you are willing to re-explore in your life, maybe sit on this a while, don't read it. But if that's something you're willing to unpack, I think this book is pretty phenomenal and is told in such a fascinating and introspective lens. Talia Lavin is a Jewish woman that is talking about this, so it's kind of a little bit of the author removed from the current circumstance, which I think gives this a better interpretive lens with how to like dissect this. And so, yeah, this one is one I can't escape thinking about, and I don't really want to, even though it's really difficult. This book has been kind of hard to recommend because I think it's a really niche topic that really approaches this in not a thorough like cultural lens, but through a really introspective viewpoint of like what mental illness does to an individual. And this is On Agoraphobia by Graham Cavney, and it is really fascinating. It's a lot of these really short little bursts of writing talking about his agoraphobic life, how basically for his entire adulthood, he's never left like a 10-mile radius of his house, how much of life he has missed out on by simply being trapped in his local environment, and how just looking out the window and looking out at the world from the perspective of just never leaving his home has given him such a kind of isolated presentation that he is just filled in a society that continuously grows smaller and smaller, and yet he is supplanted perfectly within nothing. And it's really fascinating. It's a really beautiful portrait. It's one of those books that I think will resonate with a lot of people. And for me, I've experienced quite a few periods of agoraphobia in my life, and I've never really found a book that's presented this topic in a really both like beautifully articulate way, but also one that is like personally resonant. And so this is a really fascinating book for me that I loved spending time with. And I think if you haven't experienced it, this might be an interesting read, but it won't probably be a read that'll just like knock you on your back. This is one that I will probably quietly return to over the years because there are so many just little sentences here and there that I found to be just so raw and so authentic that I was both in love with the writing of this book and also the creativity that made this book happen. So I cherish this book, and it's one that I will think about so often over the years, especially as I go out to write my own mental health memoir. It is not the particular lens through which I am trying to approach my story. However, this is both a creative and personal approach that I deeply appreciate. What had been number 17 on my list and is now number 24 is The Weight of Nature, How a Changing Climate Changes Our Brains by Clayton Page Aldern. And this is really a look at the neuroscience of climate change. I've read so many books on climate change over the years, and this one approaches it from a wholly unique topic, really talking about kind of the individual and how our brain chemistry is changing in the era of climate change and some of the pitfalls that are awaiting us out there in the world, from cyanobacteria that are just waiting in the warming waters to infect our brain and kill us. Which is a fascinating and horrifying thing to think about, this is just a kind of becoming more and more common experience in our life, to how a heating planet makes us angrier, how this is going to lead to global catastrophes and also interpersonal relationship issues. Like anger is something that we really need to watch out for in the future, and this book kind of puts this in the horror story of the future. I think this is a really fascinating look that maybe is not going to be like the most essential book for understanding the grand scope of climate change. However, it might be the most personally relatable story that I've read. I think it's told in such a compelling way that it makes some of the most dense and hard to understand topics extremely approachable, that the author talks you through and explains exactly how these things are occurring. And there are a lot of systems of power and a lot of systems of biochemistry interacting within this book that it's one of those things that if you're like any type of person that loves trivia, you love just like random knowledge, this is going to be a perfect read for you that is not only going to give you so many different facts and things to think about, but it's also going to give you a good presentation for how we should like conceive of the future. Next up, we have Cannibal Capitalism by Nancy Fraser. I did this one as an audiobook, and it was something that I just couldn't put down. Nancy Fraser recontextualizes the concept of capitalism as kind of a social quality instead of a purely economic quality. That capitalism is this self-consuming entity, but not only is it self-consuming in the grander scope of things, but also in the like a personal relationship and how we conceive of ourselves, how we conceive of care networks networks. It's so engrossing, and I think like the recontextualization really supplants capitalism not as just an economic model that we are living through, but the entire system that we are living through. And I love talking about capitalism in this way because I think it does a really good job at making the whole system of capitalism so much more relatable to the individual. So if you ever get a chance, I think this is one of those essential books for understanding kind of our present moment, how it relates to our own internal lives, and how it's like one of those things that this is a truly inescapable part of our present moment. I think it's fascinating. I think it's one of those best books that you could read with another person because the intersections it has with like social systems, with care networks, with being disabled, or with being any type of disenfranchised part of this country or this society or this world, I think you will truly latch on to these really relatable moments, and it'll be great conversation starters with people. And now, not cracking the top 20 anymore, this is number 21 on this list now. This is When the Clock Broke, Con Men, Conspiracists, and How America Cracked Up in the Early 1990s by John Gans. John Gans is a kind of Substack writer. He's a public journalist, and he is working this bit of history in some of the most approachable and comedic ways. This book is laugh out loud funny. Like, there are truly parts of this book where I am both like shoving my hand in my face and also just like cracking up because he is so cutting and so articulate of just the exact bullshit that created the modern society. When the Clock Broke is, I think, a perfect book for understanding how we got here. I think this book does an incredibly good job at making history come alive, but also making you really assess just exactly how the dumbest people in society came to power, how they have created not only this future that we're living through, but the reality in which we process everything. It is so fascinating to look at these characters, not only as villains, but as just these comically inept and evil entities. I think this book does a fabulous job of stripping the mystique of power. It really talks to you about the real lives of these people and these individuals that have grown and accumulated power so much that they are defining eras of human history. And if you're a history reader at all, I think this is one that you absolutely should not miss. And finally, the first fiction book to add to the list, the Booker Prize winner from this year, it's Orbital, a novel by Samantha Harvey. I was really in love with the quietness of this book. It's the story of 6 astronauts and cosmonauts just flying around the Earth and their perspectives of watching the Earth below, of being isolated from these events, and just kind of their reflections on looking at a world that is kind of crumbling and burning. This is something that I've written about a little bit, of watching natural disasters happen, especially from a landlocked state like Indiana, that climate change is a thing that I know is happening here in my environment, but that the big disasters that we latch onto as a society are happening elsewhere. They're things that I'm watching from my phone, and this is a really important topic, I think, for the future, and this book kind of is that book in an essence, but it's so much more reserved in the ways that I've talked about it. I think it is so calming and quieting and disconcerting all at the same time. I thought this was an incredible experience at just watching subtlety in action. I thought that was the greatest hallmark of this book, is like what is between the lines as much as what is in the lines. And I think that eerie quality that we have about our future, that's exactly what's explored in this book. And so I was really in love with this. It's a book that I finished in a day. It's not that long. It's kind of easy to do, but I think it's one of those things that I will probably reread in the future. I like that idea of perceiving what is out there, perceiving what we have trouble understanding, and perceiving all of the connective issues that form the world and the reality that we live in. And this is a book that allows you to kind of sit with that. And I think that's fabulous. And I really desire to read a lot more books in this genre because I like the truly introspective looks that characters and fiction can bring to processing our current moment. And this is one of those books that I think does that fabulously. What was just out of the top 10 before is now at the 19th spot, and that is I Heard Her Call My Name, a memoir of transition by Lucy Sante. This book is about gender transition later in life. I think her reflections as a late in life trans woman give me so much to reflect on how we move throughout the eras of life, how these big sweeping eras of our lives are all kind of connected and all kind of distant from each other. I thought this was such a beautiful look that not only is filled with beautiful and articulate and resonant writing, but it's also one of those things that allows the reader into this life, allows the reader to kind of sit with these thoughts and these feelings and emotions and the beautiful ways in which a story can be told in so many different distinctive parts. I think the length of this book is ultimately perfect. It's one of those books that lingers with you because of how short and how quick everything hits in this book, and it's filled with some of the best scenes and some of the best writing that I found all year, and I think it's definitely one of the best memoirs that I read all year. At number 18, we have Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. This book is a fascinating look at climate change, of telling a creative story, of processing the loss that we are currently experiencing and will only experience more in the future. I'm not going to tell you the plot of this book because I think even giving you a little bit of that is kind of a spoiler for the approach to how we talk about loss. And this is one of those books that really latches onto that concept. It finds a dozen different ways to creatively pull at the heartstrings, and it's one of those books that really was emotionally raw reading experience. I remember finishing this book while I was sitting in a sauna and literally just like weeping to myself alone in this very hot room. And so I'm just sweating and crying. This book has an incredibly beautiful conclusion that I think not only opens up the rawness of our emotions, but kind of comforts you in a very particular way. This is a book that I've seen on a lot of people's reading lists for a long while. I'm so glad I finally got around to, because I think it's a book that's ultimately infinitely translatable to our moment and will continue to be part of our moment for years and years to come. That we are living through this degraded society, that loss is all around us, and that loss is something that we are watching and something that we are experiencing, and that really sitting with that is a incredibly powerful and important thing that we need to involve ourselves in. And I could not get away from this book. And I think it's kind of delightful in its sadness. And I think that's a very particular tone which authors sometimes have trouble grasping, but for me, it was absolutely a home run. What was just sitting outside of the top 10 before and is now at 17 is Madness, Race and Insanity in the Jim Crow Asylum by Antonia Hilton. I'm part of a nonfiction bookstagram group chat, like where a bunch of us creators talk about a lot of books. We're giving each other recommendations for what to read and what's coming out, and talking about some of the best titles from the year, and also talking about some of the drama a little bit. And this is a book, when we were talking about should we award a nonfiction bookstagram prize for best book of the year, this was coming up a lot. And while it's not my favorite book of the year, it's one that I absolutely cannot deny deserves a spot on that platform, because it is telling a story that is so incredibly important and so locked in history, but also so translatable to everything we're experiencing. This is the story and the true investigation into how race and mental health collide in not only our past, but our present moment. And understanding the racial divides in our medical system, in our mental health system, and in our society are incredibly important to understanding literally any facet about mental health care or our medical care systems. And I think Antonia Hilton does a great job of exploring that, of making the history come alive, and also giving the reader the chance and opportunity to truly dissect what we are living through as the scars of history. I think this book is so well done. And I think what probably stands out the most about this book to me is I've read a lot of books over the years about the history of psychiatry and the history of the medical care system in this country. And this book is not only great for people approaching this topic as new readers, but also advanced readers. Like, there is a perfect opportunity for everyone across the spectrum, regardless of how much you know about these topics, to get so much from this book. And what was 11 is now 16. This is Swole, The Making of Men and the Meaning of Muscle by Michael Andar Broder. This is a book, kind of a personal and historical look at weightlifting and bodybuilding. I found this one to be incredibly fascinating. One of the things that I appreciate about this book the most is just that it has so much creative license, that I wish there were so many more memoirs that just approach really niche topics. Not only that speak to the larger culture, because I think that is incredibly important when you're writing a memoir, is to like relate it to the grander public, but also this is a really niche topic that I think needs explored more, because we're living through the era of fitness influencers constantly invading our feeds, and it's not one of those parts of society that we talk about that often. However, this book gives you so much time to reflect on that part of society, how it generates its own kind of politics, and how these are reflections of the grander body politic of this country, and also the internal ways that we are perceiving ourselves and our own bodies. I have gotten kind of into my own fitness journey over the last year, and so it's given me a lot of time to like personally reflect on these topics, a lot of time to dissect who I am, what I am doing, how I am perceiving my body, and I think it's one that is not totally complete in its synthesis of how we dissect culture. However, I think it just gives the reader the opportunity to think about how these things interact with our own lives, and that's something I truly cherish about reading memoirs, specifically blended memoirs that take part of culture and part of the self and give you a story and kind of enrapture you into thinking about something in a new and creative way. What was number 10 before is now 15. That is The Mourner's Bestiary by Aaron Caffel. This book is truly what I desire to write in the future. I think this is a beautiful blended memoir. The two parts of this book are the personal life of Aaron living with a illness called PKD, which is a fatal genetic illness, and how she is living with the grief of an illness that she might be passing on to her son, that might be taking her life kind of at any moment, how it has disrupted her family. And blended alongside this is a reckoning with what we are doing to our waterways in this country. This book is set in New England. It's set along the coastline of how the water systems, how the fisheries are all in harm's way because of the era of climate change, the acidification that we are seeing in our oceans, the heating waters, and the rising tides. This is all a really fascinating topic that takes in these really beautiful, articulate, and small portions of writing about nature and climate, and extending them into this grand scope of feeling loss, of processing our own finality. I think it's a beautiful story that is only going to become more and more popular as time goes on. And this book is ultimately, I think, just a beautiful reflection of culture, of our climate change, of our society, of loss, and of being part of a family. I love this book. I think it's one of those books that just fully envelops you. It's one of those things that you can't escape thinking about, and you ultimately won't want to. What was my 9th read of the year is now 14, and that's Disaster Nationalism: The Downfall of Liberal Civilization by Richard Seymour. This book set my brain on fire. I have been thinking about this book constantly since I read it. It's one of those inescapable political philosophies that just sticks with you and informs everything you do and read and see in the news, in the books, in the media. This is one of those things that I think is just one of the basics of political education. And really what it is a political philosophy exploring the concepts that we are not living through a fascist era. We are living through the rise of nationalism, and that fascism is what comes in the future. I think this is a perfect articulation for how we should view our modern moment. Not only do I think it sits with this concept that nihilism is something that we really need to process in our culture, but that our future of fascism is not yet written. But I think this book is hopeful. It is definitely a hopeful warning for exactly what awaits us in the future, but I think that's an important recontextualization because I think it fights a lot of the nihilism that a lot of us are experiencing within culture. I think this book is now firmly supplanted in the basics of my political education. I think it's one of the most essential books that I would add to anyone's reading list that is wanting to understand politics, that is wanting to understand media, that is wanting to understand where we are headed in our future, because I think this speaks to all of that, and it's so well done. It makes incredibly dense and difficult topics extremely approachable. I really think there's very few books that give you a political, philosophical approach to talking about society that are as accessible and as readable as this. If you're in a book club, I strongly suggest you read this because I think this is one of the best books that you could talk about with friends. And the conversations that I've had with my friends that have picked this up have been some of the most productive conversations that I've had about politics, and I can't thank this book enough for starting those conversations, for giving me the education, and for giving me the lens through which to view culture, because I think it is truly fascinating, horrifying, and also kind of comforting. What was number 8 and is now 13 is Slow Down: The Degrowth Manifesto by Kohei Saito. This is a book that I really struggle to recommend to people because it's incredibly dense and requires so much other reading to really dive as deep as you can into this topic. What this book is is a look at Marxist historical materialism and how it relates to our era of climate change, how we can have a Marxist approach to the concepts of our future economics, particularly in a lens of how it interacts with climate change, how these systems are not, as some social theorists have recommended or have read or have talked about, that these are not inseparable parts for how we should conceive of the future, but that this particular lens can give you so much hope for processing a really beautiful future. Doesn't lean itself so far into utopianism, but really stops itself short of ecological fascism. I think this book really gives you this context for how we should view a sustainable future that is equitable and that is beautiful. It's a short book, but it's one that requires a lot of care and time and attention. It's one of those things that you absolutely should be looking at the footnotes. You should be reading other sources while you're also reading this. And that if you're willing to sit with it, I think you'll really fall in love with it. However, it's just one that for the general public, and recommending books widely to an audience and never knowing where the algorithm is going to put my recommendations in society, it's not one that I'm just going to say, oh, you'll love it, and irrespective of who sees it. If you are thinking about our modern moment, if you are thinking about culture and politics and economics in an incredibly critical lens, I think this book is going to become essential for you. I think it's going to give you so much beautiful theory to consider, and it's definitely one of those books that has made me realize that as much theory as I read, I gotta read a lot more, because I think this book is ultimately incredibly rewarding. It was one of my favorite reading experiences of the year, not only in the moments that I was spending with this book, but of how I've been able to think about this topic basically daily since I read this book. And if you want a book that just lingers within you, there might be no better book on this entire video than this one right here. So last year we had a really famous book come out about women and spending time in mental hospitals, and I hated it. And I don't particularly love spending my time talking shit about books, so I won't. But I will tell you about a book that is about women in mental hospitals that I absolutely adored, and that is Committed: On Meaning in Mad Women. This is a memoir, but this is also a literary historical perspective on women and insanity and asylums. This book is just so dense, so beautiful, so creative, that it's kind of like 45 different things all in one. And I truly don't know how the author was able to capture all of this and so much personal history and so much literary history and so much analysis of culture all in less than 300 pages. I could not put this book down. I didn't want to. I was enraptured by every single word on this page, and I am a person that takes screenshots of a lot of the books that I read, and I have 25, 30 screenshots of this book that I have gone back and looked at. And it's one of those things that I will just pull myself into a little moment of thinking about this book and thinking about the topics in this. And regardless of whether you've had your own interactions with the mental health care system, whether you've been in an asylum or not, I think it's one of those things that is just resonant by and large, because I think insanity and mental health and mental illness and the culture of mental illness is something that we think about basically constantly. It's just one of those things that is an inescapable part of how we are living. And as a reader and as a writer, I'm just so incredibly impressed and thankful that I got to spend time with a book that is able to creatively tell so many different stories that all intersect and interact and create this person and create this book. I love this book. At number 11 now on this list is The Viral Underclass: The Human Toll When Inequality and Disease Collide by Stephen W. Thrasher. And this is one of my favorite works of American studies and of journalism. This is definitely a good historical perspective on the AIDS era, but also its relationship to our COVID era is just this perfect weaving of history and the current moment of this back and forth. Not only is this book a beautiful articulation of how illness is an individual topic, how it disrupts the lives of particular people, but of how we should conceive of illness in a grander scope, how illness and disease is a social and systemic issue that this lens is not often the presentation for how we conceive of topics, how we conceive of pandemics, and how we conceive of the communicable diseases that we are spreading amongst ourselves. I think this book gives such a beautiful lens into not only disability history, I think this book does a perfect presentation of how we have buried so much of our history and how there are so many things that we are just unwilling to talk about. And this book just lays it out right before you. And I think it's just incredibly beautiful and incredibly resonant. This makes history come alive. And not only is this just a spectacularly written book, I think it's one of those things that is incredibly important for understanding society. Because I think what this book does for helping the audience understand history and disability history, specifically disability theory, is incredibly important. It's incredibly accessible. And talking about the intersections of race and class in terms of our body politic, in terms of our modern society, in terms of how we should conceive of health and healthcare is one of those things that just as a person, you absolutely must have. I think this is an essential quality for how we conceive of these topics. And there is not really any better book out there to talk about these subjects, because this will not only make this personally fascinating to you, but will also give you the grander scope of theory for how we should talk about these things. This is not only one of my favorite works on medical history and disability theory, but I think it also gives me a perfect lens through how to interpret what we're living through, and especially what we are going to be living through in the future. As pandemics and illness become even more prominent in the future, this is a perfect book for understanding those moments. If you've been wondering where all the fiction is and what all the fuss of this video is, it's because 5 of my top 10 reads of the year list were fiction. Everyone knows me as a specifically nonfiction reader, but half of my favorite books of the year were fiction, including my top 1. So let's talk about it. My number 10 read of the year is The Dutch House by Anne Patchett. I don't have a copy of this one because this was one of my favorite audiobooks that I've ever done in my entire life. This book is a grand history of a family, how their rise and fall in prominence and social class has completely changed the trajectory of their life. This book is not only just so beautifully written, it's one of those things that when I was sitting with this audiobook, I didn't want to do anything else. Normally with audiobooks, I find myself getting out and going and doing other things. And, I'll do the dishes, or I'll clean the house, or I'll be at the gym. And when I was listening to Dutch House, all I wanted to do was just sit with it. I think it's not only beautifully narrated by Tom Hanks, which was an incredibly unique experience for me. I don't listen to a lot of audiobooks with celebrity narrators, but this one was one that just lingered. And Anne Patchett is now going to be on the list of my must-read authors because I could not put this one down. I was in love with this, and I think it's one of those books that'll just consume you. It was so fascinating, so brilliant, so beautiful, and so quiet, and I cherished every moment that I spent with it. At number 9, we have Anthony Lowenstein's The Palestine Laboratory, How Israel Exports the Technology of Occupation Around the World. And I think this is a perfect work of journalism. This book is incredible in every single capacity. Not only is its organization incredibly fluid, but it's a story that builds on itself and gives the reader so much more historical context for our current moment, but analysis for how we should perceive exactly what is happening and also what is going to happen in the future. This book is genuinely breathtaking, and it's one that I could not put down. It's not a very long read, but if you're wanting any book to understand the genocide in Gaza, I think it's the top of the list for me. It's the one book that I think gives perfect context to our moment. And there's a lot of books on the history of Palestine that I think are worth your time. I think they absolutely should be on your reading list. But I think this book is really one of those important things, especially for Americans to understand, and how the grander military industrial complex is this invasive species that is destroying humanity. I think this book gives so much context to that, and I think it's also a book that will only become more and more important to read and understand as time goes on. This book is written for our modern moment, but this book also paints a vivid and harrowing picture for what awaits us in the future, and I think this is one that you absolutely must read. At number 8 on the list is a novel, but I think of it more as a short story. It is How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. This book is kind of complicated. I feel kind of conflicted about having it in my top 10 reads of the year list because a lot of this book is really good. It's not my favorite. I would say 2/3 of this book are pretty excellent, but not like some of my favorite writing that I've ever found. However, there is a story in this book that is one of my favorite things that I have ever read in my entire life. Truly one of the most creative and brilliant pieces of storytelling that I have ever consumed. This is, I think, from the second chapter of this book on basically a euthanasia roller coaster. That's all I'm going to say. It's fascinating, it's disgusting, it's horrifying, and it's so emotionally raw that it's one of those things that, like, I've both had nightmares about it and also thought about the, like, true creative potential of telling stories. This book makes me, like, so passionate as a reader and as someone thinking about how to creatively tell stories that I had to include this on my list because I think it's one of those things that will resonate for everyone, because there's so many different ways to tell stories out there, and each of us individually need to find our ways, and this book is just the perfect example of how that can exist, how that should function, how we should all tell the stories that we have swimming around in our heads. So like I said, I really liked this book, but that chapter in particular, maybe my favorite thing I read all year. At number 7, we finally have a popular book. That is Sally Rooney's Intermezzo. I adored this book. I loved spending time with this. This is the story of two brothers and their unique but complicated relationship, and how their, like, interweaving lives of going in and out of each other's lives is also filled with the people that they are bringing into lives, the people that they are dating, and how complicated and how unique the internal lives of being in really fraught social systems are. This is a book that is just so consuming and so comforting all at the same time. Sally Rooney is maybe one of my favorite fiction writers out there, and I will dive into whatever she writes. So I loved spending time with this. I'm not sure if this is my favorite Sally Rooney book. I've been trying to go back and forth in my head about whether it's this or Normal People, but I see the argument for this one. It is truly Sally Rooney growing as a writer and continuing on in her unique ways to approach a story and approach the internal and external lives, and how these are, like, flimsy barriers for how we should conceive of ourselves and how we should conceive of the people around us. And I love that. I think this is fascinating storytelling. I think it's definitely a longer book, especially for Sally Rooney, but I was so thankful for that. I love spending every moment with this, and it's one that I'll return to. At number 6, we have Something in the Woods Loves You by Jared K. Anderson. Jared K. Anderson is a poet by training, and this is his memoir of learning to deal with his mental illness. Depression had been something that was disrupting and controlling his life, and this is really only the start of his journey of trying to figure out how to process that, of how to cope with living this life that is so complicated and can be so destructive in so many ways. And he finds himself out in nature throughout this book and reflecting on how nature has interacted with the quiet moments of life, how it's provided this safe escape in order to, like, distance yourself from your own mind. And this is a book that has resonated with me in my own mental health journey, but it's also one of those books that I think anyone with depression will find this beautiful and comforting. And this book will provide a really safe and comforting space in which you can process your own emotions and feelings. In my review for this book, I said that if I had all the money, I would just buy a copy for this with every single person I know with depression, and I would send it to them, and I would send them a little note that says, I hope you love this, and let's go for a walk sometime. Because I think that's the kind of comfort and joy that I found as a reader reading this book, as someone that's done a lot of work processing my own traumas. This is something that I could not look away from this book. It's a longer read. It's one of those books that is so incredibly introspective that it requires a lot of care and attention of the reader, but it's one of those things that's just one of the most rewarding reading experiences that you'll ever have. At number 5 on the list, we have Stoner by John Williams. This book is a book about nothing. This book follows the trajectory of our main character, William Stoner, and basically his life becoming a professor, and how he lives an incredibly unassuming and unremarkable life. It follows him from childhood until the day he dies, and that's not really a spoiler. You kind of know exactly what you're getting into this entire book, and nothing comes as a surprise, and nothing could be more interesting and fascinating. I love this book. I think I really resonate with a lot of the quietness of reading. I resonate with, like, the introspective parts of life, and this is something that I think was a perfect distillation of that in such a creative way to tell a story, because I think a lot of the times we look for fiction to have these grand, huge scopes, and how characters develop and how plot is just something that is an inescapable part that is so fascinating. And this is a book that strips you from all of that and just says, hey, sit with this guy for a little while. Let him talk to you about his life, and Yeah, it's one of those things that I don't know if you've ever had that person in your life that's not really charismatic, but is so good at telling stories. Like maybe they have a dry presentation and they're kind of a rambling mess of a person, and you fall in love every single time with how they tell you a story. And that is perfectly exactly what this book is. Stoner is this long exploration of a life filled with nothing remarkable, and I find it to be one of the most endearing books that I have ever read. I think this book speaks to like the larger scope of the American dream, and I think there's so many literary and cultural theories that you can bring into the reading of this that like will deepen your appreciation. But also, if you don't feel like you're a reader that pays super close attention to like the larger grand scopes of how you should be a reader, this book will also fascinate you in the ways that it's just able to spin a story that is compelling and enrapturing. It's so beautiful in its approach, it's so beautiful in its tone, and it's so beautiful in the individual sentences that kind of just seem to drag on, but yet are always perfectly there when you need them. At number 4, we have All Things Are Too Small, Essays in Praise of Excess by Becca Rothfeld. I'm not going to talk about this one super in depth because I'm going to be rereading this soon for a book club, and I will make an in-depth analysis of this book because I think it deserves it. I think this is one of those books that come along once every few years and that you really need to latch yourself onto because it's so precise in its articulation of this modern moment and of being so present in the moment while also pulling from historical theory and pulling from philosophers from the 1800s. It's one of those books that is just mesmerizing to spend time with this creative mind that I found myself truly just like transfixed. It's one of those things that I got myself into this kind of mental fury with like, I have to finish this book, even though it was one that I know required a lot more care and attention than I gave it. And I think I'm a good reader, but reading this, I was like, I just don't understand how this person's mind operates, and I am so thankful to get to spend some time with it. So if you want a book that will just like absolutely consume you, All Things Are Too Small is one that you should definitely have on your reading list. At number 3, we have There's Always This Year on Basketball and Ascension by Hanif Abdurraqib. And if you've never seen me in any other online spaces, Hanif is my favorite writer, and this book is a perfect addition to an already spectacular writing career. I don't think you need to care about basketball or sports in general to fall in love with this book, because really what it is this beautiful, introspective, lyrical look at life of how we find ourselves in current moments, informed by the people that surround us, how we are part of a history that we find unavoidable and inescapable, but how that can be a source of comfort sometimes. This book tells so many stories that are hyper specific to Hanif as a person, that are not translatable or relatable in some grander scope, but however, the ways that he's able to describe the emotions and the ways that he is interpreting these events in his life will become something that every reader will be able to pull from in their own unique and fascinating ways. I think it's a book that just opens up the reader to a whole new world of possibilities, not only just like as a reader and reading like some of the most beautiful structural bits of craft that you will ever find in your life, but also just like telling a grander story and telling a way to creatively think about who we are as people, how we find ourselves in a moment, and how everything that came before us informed who we are. I love this book, and if you're at all a type of reader that just wants to spend time with beautiful books, you have to add this one to your reading list. You have to add all of his books to your reading list because there's really no one out there that is doing it quite like he's doing it. And I think it's something that we should like spend time with and cherish because it is so unique to be able to tell a story so beautifully and so creatively, and also one of those things that just makes me happy to be living in this moment. To be able to read these books like makes life a little bit more joyous in every real sense. What I told everyone was my number 1 read of the year is actually my number 2 read of the year, and that is Creep, Accusations and Confessions by Mariam Gerba. And this book is a fucking freight train. I read it 3 times last year, which is not a thing I have ever done in the past. I could not put this book down. It's filled with some of the most beautiful sentences you'll ever find, but it's also one of those things that just like infects and infests you. This book is really a cartography of creepiness because I think it really paints an entire scope and a grand picture and an interpretive lens for how we should view this topic. Its relationship to horror, but it's also its relationship to like the mundane parts of life. This book is searing in its approach to talking about culture, but also raw and inviting and and resonant in its ways that it talks about personal traumas. There's kind of a little bit of everything in this book. It's one of those books that's ultimately like incredibly hard to describe because every single essay in this book is a totally different topic and a different approach, but all then pulled together into like this collective vision that talks about creep and creepiness as an entity, but also as a real manifestation of something that we have to deal with, not only personally, but like culturally. And I think it's one of those things that every essay in this book was a home run for me, but then collectively just creates one of the most beautiful books that I have ever read. And my actual number one read of the year is Benjamin Labatut's When We Cease to Understand the World. This book is both fiction and nonfiction. It both tells the story of real historical figures and then transmorphs them into something fictional. It's talking about the grand descent into madness that historical figures experienced and then blended in with some of the most vivid and horrifying writing that you will ever find. This book talks about real historical figures like Schrodinger and Heisenberg, people that are like known in the grander scope of 20th century history. And these were important figures that added a lot to like our collective future. However, it also fictionalizes their lives in ways that I think is some of the most beautiful, creative storytelling that I have found in any medium ever. This is one of those books that I could not escape. I had to stop this book to go to a party at one point, and all I wanted to do and all I could think about was returning to this book because I have found this book to be inescapable. I love the ideas of people's descent into madness. This is something that in literary history has been a huge topic of conversation that is also historically significant. In literary history, the topic of people's descent into madness is like a well trod out experience, but in the history of literature, the topic of descent into madness is something that is like a well trod out experience. But this book takes it in such unique and creative capacities that I think it's one of the best reading experiences that I've ever had in my life. I adore this book. I adore this book not only on the I adore this book not only as it's like, not, I adore this book not only in its ability to tell a creative story, but I adore this book on every level. I think it has some of the most like beautiful and resonant writing on a sentence structure, but I think as a creative project is also one of the most unique things that I have ever experienced in my entire life. I think this book also does I think this book also has so much to speak about like the larger I think this book also has so much to speak on the larger contextualization. I think this book also has so much to speak on the larger contextualization that we have for catastrophe of not only the personal but the systemic and the historical that I think is such a wonderful way to tell a story that I cannot be anything but astounded to spend time with this one. And I hope this is a book that resonates for every single person because over the last 5 or 6 years, I have read 700, 800 books, and this is one of the greatest reading experiences that I have ever had. I think about this book constantly, and just as a reader, as someone that loves spending time with creative approaches to telling a story, this is just one of the best examples of like the power of creativity and the power of fully consuming yourself in a story. So my favorite book of the year, When We Cease to Understand the World. I think you should add it to your reading list if you've never read it. This is a weird and strange little story, and maybe this won't be for everyone, but this is why the power of storytelling is something that has driven eras and eras of human history. It's something that we chase after. It's something that we want to invest ourselves in. We consume movies and media and podcasts and true crime, whatever it is, because we want to fill our time with thinking of things in a creative fashion and thinking of things in unique ways. And that is what this book drives home for me. It's just like, this is what it's all about.